Hello and welcome to Passing the Torch, an online Bible study with your host and teacher, Bob Clark. Yeah, that's me. Today is lesson 4 out of the first of 8 studies that we're doing that I'm referring to as a Mosaic of Bible Prophecy. So study 1 is the introduction to all of this. And in this lesson 4, we're going to talk about Bible prophecy versus Nostradamus and psychics, etc. So if you're seeing the charts, this is an outline of what we're going through in this first study. So we're starting off with an introduction to the study, and introduction to the studies and to what is Bible prophecy and such as that. And this time we're trying to compare what is Bible prophecy versus Nostradamus and those things. Then we'll go into background for understanding Bible prophecy, key timelines for understanding Bible prophecy, and then we'll wind up going into a summary of Bible prophecies without going into the depth of going into the scriptures at that time. That's for the other 7 studies to go through in depth for the scriptures. So here's your boredom warning up front. This is going to be one of the more boring of the background lessons. So why include the boring? Because, number one, for the sake of completeness, but also some people do need to go through this lesson. You may be one of those that every once in a while you're channel surfing and you see a show on Nostradamus or Edgar Cayce or whoever, some of these psychics, and it piques your interest and you watch and you're mesmerized because of the accuracy of their predictions. No, there's been a lot of fluff put around that, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So in these lessons, we're going to talk about some examples of Bible prophecy and how specific some of those are. Then we'll talk about examples of Nostradamus's, quote, prophecy, and then other psychics and prognosticators. And we'll give you some examples from the Bible of familiar spirits and some of these same psychic and type phenomena. And then we'll go into neo-modern, you like that term? Neo-modern version of psychics, which is UFOs and aliens and such as that, and we'll compare these things. So if this really does not interest you, feel free to go ahead to some of the future lessons. They should not be this boring, okay? But even with that, this won't be that gosh awful boring, especially when we talk about the aliens and UFOs and whatever, but even the other, it has its merit. Especially when we're talking about examples of Bible prophecy. So I have 3 examples. And yes, there are some parts of Bible prophecy that they're somewhat vague and you can't understand it. I got it. But there's also some that is extremely precise and specific. So our first example, I'm going to just quickly tell you the story. Daniel chapter 5 talks about the overthrow of Babylon by the Medo-Persian Empire, specifically under Cyrus the Great. And Belshazzar, the king of Babylon at the time, had thrown a big party with all of his nobles and such, and drunken revelry and such. And in the middle of that, he calls for some of his servants to go across the street to the museum to get some of the cups and such that came from the temple in Jerusalem. Well, this was desecrating these cups that were in the temple. God didn't appreciate that at all. So he shows up in the form of a man's hand writing on the wall. You may have heard that term, the handwriting on the wall. That comes from Daniel chapter 5. All right? And it wrote on the wall. And so Belshazzar calls for Daniel, who interprets that writing, and he tells him what's going to happen. Before we read this, Daniel tells him what's going to happen, that, yeah, you've just lost the kingdom. It's going to be taken out of your hand. And later that night, Cyrus invaded later that night. It was not Cyrus specifically, it was one of his generals that invaded. And Cyrus came in a few days later. All right. In the book of Daniel, chapter 5, we're going to read a little bit of this because I want you to understand the specificity of Bible Prophecy. And this is reading out of the Literal Standard Version. And just so that you know, Literal Standard Version they try very hard to use the verb tense that is in the original. So you have to do a little bit of mental translation to put it into historical setting, right? So Daniel chapter 5, starting at verse 5 and verse 6, then we'll skip over to verse 30. In that hour, fingers of a man's hand have come forth. There was no body behind this, you understand. It's just a man's hand in space. And they are writing in front of the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king is seeing the extremity of the hand that is writing. Then the king's countenance has changed. He went white as a ghost, is what that probably means. And his thoughts trouble him. Duh, wouldn't it trouble you to see a man's hand with no man behind it, writing on the wall? Here's a key phrase. And the joints of his loins are loosed. What does that mean? To put it very politely, he had to change his pants. Now you got to understand, that part of this was a very, if you can imagine, a very public embarrassment. Everybody knew it. And it got told all around Babylon at the time. So everybody knew of this public embarrassment. And his knees are striking against one another. His knees were knocking. So skipping over to the end of the chapter, in that night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, is slain. So Daniel's prophecy came to pass. Okay, but that's sort of cheating a little bit, right? That's like watching the evening news and you know that somebody's about to invade somebody and then it comes to pass. Yeah, you could have made that prophecy. That's not what happened, but I'm not using that as an example of Bible prophecy per se. The Babylonian Talmud tells us that when Cyrus did come in a few days later, came into the city of Babylon, Daniel presented him with the scroll of Isaiah and pointed him to the part where it talked about Cyrus by name. And we're going to read that. That's what I'm talking about with Bible prophecy. So 150 years or so before Cyrus was even born, God named him through the prophet Isaiah. So, reading out of the literal version, the LITV, this is Isaiah 44, verses 28 through chapter 45, verse 5. This is one of the places in the Bible where the chapter break wasn't really correct, or should have been put someplace else. All right. And another thing to note is there's several places in here in this where the LITV, they added some words that are in italics to try to help the meaning. I'm going to take some of those out because it doesn't really help the meaning. All right. He, that is God, says to Cyrus, my shepherd, and he shall and he shall complete all my pleasure. Whose pleasure? God's pleasure. Even to say to Jerusalem, you are built, and to the temple, you are founded. Now I'm going to interject this. We find out that I believe in the book of Ezra and in several other places, Cyrus gave permission for the Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. He wasn't specific on rebuilding Jerusalem. He was specific on rebuilding the temple. And he even gave them money towards that. But he allowed them to go back to Israel. So says Jehovah to his anointed, to Cyrus. He named him 150 years before, to Cyrus, whom I have seized by his right hand to subdue nations before him. Well, he had just subdued this nation, right? Yea, I will open the loins of kings. Cyrus had just heard about this when he came into town and found out that that's what happened with Belshazzar. So he understands the specificity of this prophecy. Yea, I will open the loins of kings, to open the two-leaved doors before him. And it recently occurred to me what this is meaning. And I I'll get into the great detail of this later on, but that has to do with the gates on the inner wall that were left open when they came in to take over Babylon. And the gates shall not be shut. I will go before you and make hills level. I will tear apart the bronze doors and cut the iron bars in two. And I will give you the treasures of darkness, even treasures in secret places, that you may know that I am Jehovah, who calls you by your name, the God of Israel, for my servant Jacob's sake, and for Israel my elect. I entitle you, I name you, but you do not know me. Cyrus was impressed that God had named him 150 years before he was born. He was so impressed with that and with correctly pointing out the loosening of the loins that he allowed them to go back and rebuild the temple. So let's give a second example of how specific Bible prophecy can be. All right? In the second example, we're still going to go back to Daniel, and this will be Daniel chapter 9. He gave, or Daniel was given the prophecy of the exact day that Jesus would ride into Jerusalem on the donkey on Palm Sunday and be hailed as King of Israel. Daniel chapter 9, starting at verse 24. I'm going to resist the urge to get into and explain every little thing right now. I'm just going to read through it and give the math behind it, and we'll get into the details in several later lessons. So starting at verse 24 in chapter 9. 70 periods of 7 are determined for your people and for your holy city. And you know and consider wisely from the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the leader or Messiah the king is 7 periods of 7 and 62 periods of 7. And after the 62 periods of 7, Messiah is cut off, but not for himself. So, again, we'll do the details later on. But it says, from the going forth of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. So that is from March 14th, 445 BC, when King Artaxerxes gave the order to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. He gave that, if you look at the book of Nehemiah, he gave that message there. Okay? Now then, you have 7 periods of 7 plus 62 periods of 7. So 7 plus 62 times 7, those periods of 7, it's talking about years. So times 7 years per period times 360 days per year, because that's what a prophetic calendar is. We'll explain that later. So we have 173,880 days. If you go from March 14th, 445 BC to, or if you go take that and add in 173,880 days, you get to April 6th of 32 AD. That's the exact day that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on the 10th of Nisan. The 10th of Nisan is when the Passover lamb is presented to the priests. All of these are prophecies and prophetic types that were fulfilled specifically. So our third example, David wrote about the crucifixion from the point of view of Jesus 1,000 years before it ever occurred, and 600 years before crucifixion was ever devised as a form of capital punishment. So crucifixion was devised by the Persians and then adopted and, if you will, perfected by the Romans. In Psalm 22, David gives many of the events that occurred at the cross in such detail as if he were watching the events unfold. We're not going to read the full psalm, but I'm going to hit some of the high points. Okay, so Psalm 22, it starts off with, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That sounds familiar. Well, that's what Jesus cried out. Okay, but that's Jesus filling in the prophecy, not the other way around, not a prophetic thing. Personally, I believe that Jesus quoted this whole prophecy because when it comes to the end of it, it is finished, is what Jesus said. That's effectively what the prophecy, how the prophecy ends, if you understand the Hebrew. But let's keep going. This just sets us up. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip. They shake their head, saying, he trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. That's a verbatim quote from the book of Matthew, I believe. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, and it is melted within me. So if you understand the medical side of this, because there's been doctors that have went through and explained what crucifixion was like, and that mechanism, this follows the medical definition of crucifixion. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. If you remember, Jesus said, I thirst. That thirst was part of the crucifixion. It was going to happen because of the way things, everything played out. You have brought me to the dust of death, for dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. So, dogs have surrounded me. Dogs is a type of Gentiles, specifically wicked Gentiles. They pierced my hands and my feet. Well, what happened on the cross? They pierced his hands and his feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. When he had the cat of nine tails, when he was beaten with that, his flesh was torn off. You could see his bones, his rib cage and such. I can count all my bones, and you stare and look at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Wait, I've heard that. I read that in was it Matthew or Luke, one or the other, or both? Because that's what they did with Jesus. This is specific 1,000 years before it happened. Now, let's switch and look over at Nostradamus. Who was Nostradamus? He was a French pharmacist. Pharmacist. Dealt with drugs. Who was born in the year 1503 and died on July 2nd of 1566. He has been accredited with, not accredited, but credited by some with prophetic writings that have supposedly predicted modern events. Those who say that Nostradamus predicted events in history have to really contrive hard to make it say what they want it to say. And we're going to get into that. So here's an example. Prediction of the rise of Hitler. In the year that is to come, this is from Nostradamus' writings. In the year that is to come, and not too far from Venus, the two greatest ones of Asia and Africa shall be said to come from the Rhine and Ister. Crying and tears shall be at Malta and on the Italian shore. What? The followers of Nostradamus claim that Ister means Hitler, but the word Ister can be shown that it's referring to the lower Danube River. So they've got to put their own meanings on words and such as that to make it mean what they want it to mean. So here's a second thing of what they say, the 9/11 attacks. In the year of the new century and 9 months, from the sky will come a great king of terror. The sky will burn at 45 degrees. Fire approaches the great new city. Well, that sounds pretty impressive, doesn't it? Well, statements in different writings of Nostradamus's and in different parts of his writings had to be put together to get this 4-statement section. So they're called quatrains. So they had to add a piece of this quatrain and a piece of that quatrain and put them all together to come up with this quatrain that all relates, semi-relates. The actual primary quatrain is this. The year 1999 7th month, from the sky will come a great king of terror to bring back to life the great Mongol king before and after Mars to reign by good luck. What? Who is the king of terror coming from the sky, and how does that relate to the airplanes that flew into the buildings? How does the sky burning at 45 degrees relate to the burning of the buildings? And although New York City has the word new in its name, it in no way can be described as a new city, considering it's one of the older cities in the country. Okay? So, and online, I wish I would have written down the place where I found this, but inline, you can go and look up Nostradamus and accuracy of prophecies, and you should be able to find the same thing. So, there's a number of different prophecies, quote, prophecies that he had, and how well did he did. So, he prophesied 1580, and after the Civil War ended in 1580, France would be gloomy. Well, he was close. He talked about a failure, no inquisition of astrologers in 1607. Wrong on that. Liturgy or not, a clear failure, no event in Tunis. Okay, so wrong on so many of these things. There was a few of them where he was semi-close, others, so-so. Most of them, he was just plain wrong. Nostradamus was not a prophet. I want to tell you, it was drug-induced state of ecstasy, or whatever you want to call it. The same as, I'm going to pick somebody from history, Charlie Manson, or some of these others, David Koresh, that go into this drug-induced state and have all sorts of stuff, say all sorts of stuff that sounds, ooh, but it's not real. So what about other psychics and prognosticators? Let's get real. 99.99% of these people, palm readers, psychics, and whatever else, they're swindlers. All they want is your money. However, there's a very small percentage with a little better than average success rate. Of these, many claim to know things about the past that they shouldn't know. And sometimes investigation proves that's correct. They know things that they really shouldn't know. Napoleon's maid really did have red clothes. I'm not making stuff up. Okay? It's like, how did they know that? How might they be correct on some past events? It's by what we call familiar spirits or demonic spirits. Familiar spirits, demonic spirits that have been on earth probably since before Adam was created. So let's look at an example of familiar spirits. And at one point I thought I was going to read through all of this, but I'm just going to tell you the story. You can go and read it in the book of 1 Samuel, in chapter 28, if you want to read the full thing yourself. So in this story, Samuel the prophet had already died. Saul is left on his own, if you will, and he really wants the advice of Samuel. So he goes he has his men to find, is there anybody who is into divination that I can go and see if we can call up Samuel to where I can talk to him. Well, you have to understand that he had already made divination and such as that punishable by death, as according to the law of Moses. So he was enforcing that. So they found this woman, you may have heard of the witches of Endor or whatever. Okay, so she was a woman from Endor who had a familiar spirit. Saul goes, he disguises himself to where she doesn't realize that he's the king, but then she realizes that he's the king. She calls up Samuel from the grave. Now, was it really Samuel or was it just a demon? Don't know, and it almost doesn't really matter. We know that she did it by this familiar spirit. And this being that got called up told Saul that, yeah, you're going to die tomorrow. And it came to pass. But it wasn't through a godly action. This was through demonic action that he gets told this information. So did that demon also have a hand in killing Saul the next day? Possible, to make sure that the, quote, prophecy happened. So let's look at a second example of familiar spirits or spirits of divination, fortune-telling spirits. Paul dealt with a girl who was possessed with a spirit of divination. That is this demonic spirit. In Acts chapter 16, starting at verse 16. Now it happened as we went, that is Paul and Luke who's writing and whoever else is with them at the time, as we went to prayer, that a certain slave girl possessed with a spirit of divination met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune telling, that is, telling the future. This girl followed Paul and us and cried out, saying, "These men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation." Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? Isn't she doing a good thing? How can that be demonic? Because she's disrupting. If that was done in a church service today, that would be disruptive. That's not God. Okay? And that's what she's trying to do, is disrupt. And this she did for many days. I'm going back to the verses. But Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And he came out that very hour. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. So what happened? Once that demon was cast out, she could no longer, quote, tell the future. Besides that, what future do you want to know from a known liar? Demons are known liars. You're going to at best, learn a half-truth or something extremely depressing. Okay? So why did Paul wait for many days before he did that? Because he's waiting for that gift of discerning of spirits to show up, to tell him, now's the time, cast it out. She may have been hanging around them all that time, that word of God going on the inside of her. And it took a number of days for her to be willing to give up that demon. So we talked about psychics and such, that if there is anything, that it's demonic. But now we're going to go into this neo-modern version of psychics. That's what I'm calling it. UFOs and aliens. So we're going to detail some of this in later lessons as it applies, but I'm going to give you a summary now. Persons claiming to have routine or recurring contact with, or that allow aliens to speak or write through them, are willingly allowing themselves to be used by lying, seducing, and familiar spirits. Okay? See, all right. I'm trying to see where I am in my lesson. There are people that say that, well, I'm just allowing this alien to write through me, or here's the message from the alien, and they give a message. It's demonic. All right? That's exactly the same thing that you see with somebody who is demon-possessed. All right? But that happens, and is happening more and more as we go. Aliens and UFOs are not intergalactic, but they are interdimensional. I'm not trying to prove it right now. I may try to prove all this later. But you'll find more and more secular ufologists, people who study UFOs, ufologists, that are calling these things demons. They are realizing they're not intergalactic. They are interdimensional. They pop in and out of our dimension. They realize they're not showing up in far outer space. They are in our galaxy, our solar system, our atmosphere. UFOs do not follow the laws of physics for entities with mass. So if they're just intergalactic, you would expect them to have mass. You would expect them to follow the laws of physics. They don't. They may be flying along at 20,000 miles an hour. This is a specific case. 20,000 miles an hour and make a right-hand turn. That is something that it does not have mass. UFOs are not picked up on radar in deep space, coming around Saturn or whatever. They're not picked up. So they're always in the atmosphere or a short distance above it. Some of the space vehicles, some of the astronauts have claimed to see UFOs in space. Yeah, I don't doubt it. That's still close to the Earth. They appear and disappear at will, similar to the way that Jesus appeared in a locked room with the disciples after he was crucified and glorified and came back. He was in a different set of dimensions. So he could go into and out of our set of dimensions at will. Here's another thing is I talked about the messages from these aliens. There's also abductions and such as that, and people say that they were abducted. Whether it is people giving messages or the messages that people hear during their, quote, abductions, all of these messages are very similar in that they attack the Bible, they attack Jesus. A lot of them say, oh, Jesus was one of us. Jesus was an alien, trying to separate people from the truth. They are being used to set up the excuses that will be used by the Antichrist to explain the rapture. We'll get into that part of it a lot more later. Aliens and such as that are now providing non-biblical, non-God, quote, scientific excuses for where life came from as more scientists recognizes the impalpability of evolution. Folks, evolution is one of the worst lies ever told by science. It is so easily disprovable by science. But they bought onto the lie for so many years. Now that they're waking up to, oh, that can't be true. So then how did life start? It started by the aliens deposited on Earth. It wasn't from the goo, it was from the aliens. So have you noticed there's a very large increase in the normalization of ufology in the last few years? What do I mean by that? We wind up with, in Congress, they're having meetings now, talking to people that say, oh, the United States Air Force has aliens in captivity, and we have downed UFO ships and such as that. What are they doing? They're building stories. They're building stories that the Antichrist can use when it comes about. All right? So let's do some some comparisons here. Bible prophecy. In all the timed prophecies in the Bible, that is, things that should have already happened, 100% of them have happened with 100% accuracy. Many more are still to happen, but we can expect them to happen with the same accuracy. This study is going to go into depth on both the historic and the future prophecies. We're not going to hit all the prophecies because there's too many of them through the Bible. Go read your Bible if you want to hit all of them. All right? But we're going to go through a lot of those. Well, what about psychics, whether it's Nostradamus or anything like that? Of all the supposed psychics, etc., maybe some predictions have occurred. Most are based on very vague wording. Only a small percentage have happened. And the accurate ones, even though they are still a small percentage of that person's predictions, the accurate ones were likely either guesses or demonic to sucker in gullible people. Well, what about aliens and UFOs and such as that? They behave exactly as the Bible describes demons and fallen angels. They're setting up the end-time deception by the Antichrist. So that's where we are. So we've been going through talking about Bible prophecy versus Nostradamus and psychics and UFOs and such as that. And really the main reason is to show you that out of all these things, Bible prophecy is the only thing that can be trusted 100% of the time to be 100% accurate. Okay? That's the reason we're going through these whole set of studies. Next time, we're going to come out of some of this more boring introduction, and we'll talk about, we'll go into the background of understanding Bible prophecy, next time, the basis for understanding Bible prophecy. So these will not be as boring of lessons. I promise you will learn how do you understand Bible prophecy, and we'll get into some of that. All right? So we hope that you come along with us next time as we go through more talking about Bible prophecy here on Passing the Torch. So long.